Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Ray Tampa Podcast. Our podcast offers bold commentary on various subject matters by maintaining a laser-like focus on the truth. My name is Ray Tampa, and I'm the host of the Ray Tampa Podcast. We have in our studio two talented and intelligent gentlemen, Mr. Russell Cato and Mr. Jamie Wilson III, my co-hosts. Also, we're honored and pleased to have as our guest Mr. Brant Robinson, an American history teacher at Deniers High School. This guy is sharp.
Yes.
Welcome to the program, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. It is a pleasure. I am honored and humbled to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. These are critical times, but as we know, we're in this together. So thank you.
All right, we're in it together, most definitely. Today, we're going to tackle the subject concerning Florida's Department of Education standards and the firestorm they have caused. To begin, I want to point out the fact that people locally, statewide, as well as nationally, have offered some very pointed comments in criticizing these standards and Governor DeSantis for promoting these standards. Locally, Dr. Goliath Davis wrote an excellent article that appeared in a community newspaper that seems to have covered all the bases for being critical of the standards and the political environment supporting the ridiculous narratives. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read a portion of Dr. Davis's article. Following the reading of the article, Mr. Robinson is going to offer us a few comments about what I've read, as well as anything else he want to talk about. And my guests will chime in as appropriately. Here's the article. The title, The Politics of Historical Distortion. The article. MAGA Republicans have weaponized deliberate, outrageous lying. They employ it shamelessly and without reservation. Regrettably, its obvious intent is to divide our nation on the one hand and destroy what most of us have come to know as democratic principles, practices, and institutions on the other. Florida's governor and its MAGA lawmakers have embarked on a course to make Florida the most divisive state in America by stoking racism, sexism, homophobia, and any other culture war they believe will secure their power. In 2020, DeSantis signed into law a piece of legislation known as the, quote, Stop Woke Act, end of quote, which, among other things, prohibits educational instruction that could make students feel uncomfortable due to their race, sex, or national origin. But make no mistake about it, white students are the intended protected group. Many of their historical ancestral portrayals have made Black students uncomfortable for years. Governor DeSantis and his followers are history deniers. Their goal is to distort, deny, and lie to de-emphasize the violence and inhumanity suffered by the indigenous populations, Black people, and other people of color. DeSantis is so proud of his divisive policies and practices and has made them the centerpiece of his presidential campaign. The state of Florida recently released its newly revised educational standards. The history standards have stirred debate and criticism nationwide. The freshly promulgated standards attempt to sanitize historical atrocities and distort the realities of the Tulsa race massacre. Florida's Ocoee massacre of 1920. They have failed in doing that because of the fact that most Floridians know the truth about what's going on. So at this point, there's a lot more to Dr. Davis's statement, but we're going to stop it here. And I'm going to ask Mr. Robinson to chime in on what he's heard, as well as anything else he would like to say about what's going on in African-American history here in Pinellas County in particular.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, I would want to remind your viewers that, as you mentioned, in July of 2022, two laws took effect. The Parental Rights in Education law, also known as Don't Say Gay, and the Stop Woke Act. And what the Stop Woke Act now allows parents and guardians to do is to sue a school district or a school in particular if they feel like their child has been subjected to indoctrination. And those three words, those words about a student feeling guilt, discomfort, and anguish, that has already been on the books for a year. And I want to remind your viewers that going back to 2011, when a law was passed here in the state called Senate Bill 736, it now means that all teachers hired in the state are on annual contract. And that's important because now at the end of the year, teachers' jobs are much more tenuous. And at the end of the year, their principal has to determine whether they're going to be rehired. And part of that rehiring process is dependent on how well their students do on standardized test scores. So over the past year, there's no question that more history teachers have been more cautious in their teaching of American history. In some cases, maybe in the past, they showed a video clip that might have been graphic and they've gotten parents to sign permission slips to allow them to watch it, but maybe they don't do that anymore. Or maybe they don't have their students read primary sources about what it was like to be an enslaved human being anymore because they're worried that some student's going to complain to their parents and it's going to result in some kind of a lawsuit. So it's important to understand these revisions and the standards in the context of what's already taking place. Now, that first standard has gotten a lot of attention. And I frankly want to understand what was the motivation in changing the standard to read that now not only are we supposed to teach about the peculiar institution, not only are we supposed to teach about the injustice, the barbarity, and the horrors of racial slavery, but now we're supposed to teach our students, quote, skills that enslaved human beings may have learned for their, quote, personal benefit. And you have to just sit with that for a second because those are adults that are seemingly qualified and understanding of our history. What was the motivation in making that change in the first place? And is the goal to have students, remember, this standard is going to appear in sixth grade because in Florida, U.S. history is broken into two halves. If you're a sixth grader and you've not been exposed to any African-American history, is the goal so that students might say, you know, racial slavery just wasn't that bad. Right. Or, hey, at least people gain some kind of benefits or skills. So in my estimation, it's quite chilling.
Well, I want to make a comment here about the uncomfortable feeling that students might have when you tell the truth. And in doing that, as Dr. Davis stated in his article, the protected group is the white group of students. They're the ones that this seems to be focused on protecting. But what about the Black students that are told that being slaves wasn't so bad because they might be learning a trade? That's as ridiculous as it comes. These slaves are being tortured, beaten, raped, sold, separated from their families and all of that, but they might have learned a trade. So it's all good, as ridiculous as it gets. So the question is, what about the Black students that are feeling uncomfortable? Should they file a suit against the district for allowing teachers to teach this nonsense? That's a question that needs to be explored. Jay,
our whole educational experience as kids has been uncomfortable. You know, reading about slavery, learning about slavery, the lynchings, the hangings. We've endured that from young kids all the way up to adulthood. So this is BS. This is BS. And then they want to try to take the sting out of it. Oh, well, they learned some trades that helped them out. That's bullshit. You know, and my mom, we watched Roots once. And she wouldn't let us watch it growing up. Like just, you know, the graphics, just seeing it. it doesn't make you hate, but it back then it makes you like, if I was there, I would do, you know, X, Y, Z. Of course, everybody says that, you know what I mean? But that,
That's an interesting point. Your mom decided you didn't need to see it anymore.
right. He's
You
like,
didn't
that's
need to
it.
see it anymore.
Yeah.
Obviously, you all felt uncomfortable, or your mom felt that you all were uncomfortable. And that's
It
still
was sad,
history.
man.
It's sad history, but that's still history.
Yeah.
Roots portrayed the actual suffering and torture
Right.
and all of that. So
Right.
I'm glad you brought that point up. Hold one point. I wanted to go to Russ because I saw him wanting to say something.
Well, the whole thing that you got to look at DeSantis' overall objective. His overall objective is to destroy public education. Let's look at it. That's what he wants to do. The other thing that he's trying to do, how do he teach racial oppression? How he does that? Now, I heard you say this, and I had an argument with a friend the other day on this. Define what the word truth is. You see, that's hard because you can take the truth and it becomes a lie. In other words, if I'm in power to define truth, it becomes my way because it's power.
Mhm.
You see, truth, when you're telling the truth, you're trying to unhide things. You're trying to do that. But this guy is not saying that. Truth is what they say it is.
Mhm.
You see?
Good point. What you got, Brent?
I was so grateful that Jamie, you mentioned Roots. Let's think about this. Roots, 1977.
77.
We have made tremendous progress in the state in just getting the actual standards that we have now. We should be grateful. The fact that we actually teach our students about the Rosewood Massacre, the Ocoee Race Massacre, the fact that we teach about the Chinese Exclusion Act, all of those represent real struggle and commitment on the part of scholars
Yes.
for decades and decades, because we have to remember, for most of American history, most students weren't going to school with children that were anything other than white, and they certainly weren't learning the totality of our history.
Right.
The fact that we're talking about Roots in 1977, and here we are in 2023, students can handle learning about any number of things. They have smartphones at their disposal. They have all the world's collective knowledge and wisdom at their disposal. And I'm so grateful and I'm so proud of my students on a regular basis when I know for a fact that we're engaged in a discussion in my class that frankly many adults couldn't handle. And so I think these changes really reflect two uncomfortable truths. One is that many of our fellow citizens just don't really understand what happens in public schools every day. The second is that the majority of a lot of the base of DeSantis and Trump supporters, and I say this with respect, but they are grossly undereducated about our nation's history. And the sad truth is that it's very easy to take advantage of people who just don't know much about their history.
And that's exactly what DeSantis is doing, taking advantage of the ignorance in terms of his followers, gross ignorance. Now, DeSantis majored in history, I think.
Yeah.
He used to teach history. I feel that in some degree, he is very familiar with what happened in the Rosewood Massacre,
True, he does.
as well as the Tulsa Massacre and the Ocoee Massacre. And I'm gonna tell you why. DeSantis knows that in the Ocoee Massacre, as well as Rosewood and Tulsa, they used the cover of law to murder people, because I can't remember, I think it was Tulsa, where they deployed the National Guard to help destroy the community. And I think it was was it Rosewood or Ocoee, where they used, hold on, give me a second. They used deputized citizens. They deputized citizens and used them as cover of law to go out and commit murder in those communities. Which one, Brent? Do you remember?
Well, that brings us to the second standard in question. And I don't expect your viewers to understand the specifics of that second standard, but the second standard is going to affect students that take American history in 11th grade. And again, what's the motivation of making this change? Because it's been a battle and a victory that we actually teach about the Rosewood Massacre and that we teach about the Ocoee Race Massacre. There were dozens and dozens of race massacres in our nation's history, but under the new standard, now a teacher is required that when they teach one of those events, they have to teach it as, quote, an act in which there was violence perpetrated, and here's the critical wording, against and by African Americans. Now, here's the situation in Tulsa. When that young man was arrested for supposedly making a gesture at a white girl in an elevator, he was held in the county jail, and mobs of white citizens demanded that he be released so he could be lynched. But there were also African Americans who gathered as well to protect him. And some of those African Americans did arm themselves. In some race massacres, there were African Americans who armed themselves to protect themselves. But in no case were there ever a race massacre in our nation's history that was instigated by African Americans. So again, is the change in the standard somehow to try and create some kind of equivalency? So now students won't see this as a race massacre. Right. They'll just see this as some kind of unfortunate event where people on both sides got together and it just got out of hand.
Very key point.
And I want to say, Ray, that I really believe that this also is reflective of what we're doing just with what happened in the summer of 2020. Because after all, you still have Americans that are trying to rewrite what happened in 2020, and we all lived through that. Making accusations about Antifa, which is not even an organization that exists, conflating Black Lives Matter, which is a peaceful organization, conflating them with rioters and looters and criminals. So what's happening with the standards going back to race massacre is exactly what's happened with just recent history in 2020.
I was moving to a point. Remember the anti-riot law DeSantis signed?
Yes.
Anti-riot, where he gave motorists permission to run over protesters in the street.
Correct.
And be protected by law.
And that was when he acknowledged that there were no riots in the state of Florida. He acknowledged that, but he still passed the law.
All right. Giving the citizens, white citizens for the most part, the right to run over with their cars protesters in the streets. Also, he put together this force, called it the State Guard. And in recruiting people, originally, they told them that they were going to be used for national disasters, emergencies that were of a natural concern. But once they got all these people together, they changed the intent and started training these people in a military style to protect the state of Florida. Now, my feeling is DeSantis, knowing that the National Guard is not under his control, but the State Guard is under his control. But if they have the same powers, so to speak, as the National Guard, then that gives him even more power in the state of Florida to mistreat people.
Absolutely. You know, and this is what's so stunning is that what's taking place is that there are a base of supporters in this country who really believe there's any number of, quote, others out there that are trying to take their country. After all, what does the slogan "Make America Great Again" mean? It means that there are people out there who don't have to be identified because they're labeled as enemies, they're labeled as others. And those are the people that are trying to take your country. You know, if you already believe there's a deep state, if you believe your election was taken from you, you're likely to believe that teachers are in their classrooms trying to indoctrinate your children. They're trying to groom them. They're trying to sexualize them. So DeSantis can get away and justify creating this force because his base of supporters already believe there's all these enemies out there that are trying to take their country from them. And it's quite sinister.
And he can pass the law to support all of this nonsense.
Yes.
Yeah, see, that's why I'm coming back to you. If you look at the bill, I think it's Senate Bill 266, that's what it is. These things are already in place. They're there. My thing is, how can we get around that? That's my, I like the focus that we're doing now, that we're telling people what it is, but these things are in place. They're there. So how do we get around this? Look at you.
Education.
Yeah, but listen.
Number one, education.
Okay, but here's some concern. I looked at this teacher out of Jacksonville. He quit the public school system in the history teacher. All of us can do that. So if you're a history school teacher today and you're in a classroom and your paycheck depends on teaching, Where does it put you? How do you get around this? You got to feel this. I got the family to take care.
Mhm.
You know, and that's, listen, this is a political science curriculum. That's what this is. And it tells you it is criminalized if you go against that. If you say one thing against that, that teacher can lose his license.
That's right. And
So what do you do with this?
if you're on an annual contract, as I
Yeah.
mentioned, and you're a young teacher and you're trying to start a family and you're trying to find affordable housing, we have a major affordable housing crisis in the state. And we all know that while the governor's running around talking about things that do not exist, you know, a lot of people thought, well, maybe he's going to moderate his tone when he announced he's running for president. He's doubling and tripling down on these things, but that's because he's pacifying a base of supporters who believe these things. But at the same time, here in the state, what do we know is happening? There's a home insurance crisis, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're a young teacher and you're trying to make a living, you're trying to get started. How do you handle these laws in your classroom when you know the consequence could be you not being rehired the next year?
And
It's
that's-
quite devastating.
And that's what I'm saying. If you look at this whole thing, it's a means to destroy public education. I don't care how you look at it. That's what it is.
The truth about
Yeah,
public
yeah,
education, the
it's a
truth
destroy.
about history. You want to destroy it,
Yeah, that's right.
desensitize it, take the sting out of it.
And that's how you
But
do.
it goes back to, you know, they're talking about making kids feel uncomfortable. Or it's like you said last time we were here, it's the parents, you know, and he does cater to an uneducated base, just like Trump said. Trump said, I love uneducated people.
He sure
He
did.
said that.
He sure did.
And this guy's using, DeSantis is using the same thing. And it's misdirection. So they spew out what they want to hear instead of getting to the real issues that's going on in Florida. You know, it's just crazy.
That's right. And let's be honest. I mean, Governor DeSantis is not going to ever be held accountable to sit down with us and actually talk about the real history.
Right.
The history is the history, and
That's right.
and there it is. But if people don't know the history, and those of us who do are having our hands tied simply because we don't have a voice, we don't have a forum. My three words are educate, organize, and mobilize. Is what we're doing here. And for those of you listening, we appreciate you. We're grateful for you and all that you can do with what you're hearing from us.
Right.
We must educate, because once people find out what's going on, at the bottom, the foundation of all of this is public education. And if you believe that public schools are the foundation of our democracy, then you have to be deeply, deeply concerned about what's happening here in Florida.
I want to make another point. The standard for teaching social studies in the middle school that is causing all the discussion right now in terms of benefits of slavery. These scholars that worked on these standards, and DeSantis is real happy to point out that 2 or 3 of them were Black doctors that worked on these standards. I say to those Black doctors, take those degrees and stuff them up your butts.
Mhm.
Those doctorate degrees. What they did, in effect, was they took a narrative from the discussion concerning indentured servants and slid that narrative over to slavery.
No,
And there's a difference.
Big.
Indentured servants willingly offered their services to pay for their voyage to America from Europe. And they had a time frame in which they were donating, or in some sense, volunteering their services. 5 years, 7 years, what have you. They saw a light at the end of the tunnel, indentured servants. So at the end of the tunnel, indentured servants could become blacksmiths and all the bricklayers and all these trades, because they may have learned those trades while serving their contracts. Now, slaves didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They were permanently tied to their masters unless they escaped, or unless they somehow got enough money to buy their service from their masters. But there's a big difference. So the part about indentured servants learning trades that could be utilized once they were free that didn't apply to the African-American slaves. But these doctors slid that narrative over, and that's what has this firestorm going.
One is debt. Your voyage, you have a debt, you pay it off. The other one is I own you.
That's right.
Like a dog tied to a tree.
That's right. You're
That's the
my
difference.
permanent investment.
Right.
You're my permanent investment.
Right.
But
But Ray, they asked those professors exactly what you're saying.
I know.
And you know what they're saying? You're taking it out of context.
I heard that. That's why I brought it up.
Taking it out of context.
That's, they're saying Kamala Harris, when she was in Jacksonville and she was pointing these things out, she's taking it out of context.
But you guys know what's going to happen is students know, high school students know what's up.
Mhm.
And I feel for any teacher, my colleagues who are going to have to try to teach this standard. And how do you do it?
Can't.
How do you bring yourself after you've examined the brutality, the working conditions, the way the slave system was enforced, the resistance by enslaved people?
Mhm.
And of course, hopefully, although doubtfully, but hopefully teachers might actually teach that, you know what came out of enslavement was a beautiful, unique culture that was born called African Americans. That culture was born. And what that culture has given to America is hard to measure. But yet you would put a teacher in a position to somehow have to try and explain that there were benefits. And for example, if an enslaved person became a blacksmith, what happened? That enslaved person was then hired out to other plantations, and the only person who benefited from that was the slave owner.
Exactly.
So it's hard for me to understand the rationale that adults who should know better, who presumably were trained in history, could actually put teachers in a position to have to try and explain that, because I can tell you there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable times in classrooms where teachers are sitting there and a student says, why are we talking about benefits of slavery? But my governor is not going to be held accountable for that. And that's why we have to.
And he doesn't care if he's putting out false narratives. He doesn't care if he's putting out misinformation. He doesn't care anything except let me tell my stupid followers
Mhm.
what I think they should know.
Right. The uneducated.
Uneducated.
But the kids, like you said before, these kids are exposed to everything. They know how to get on the dark web. They know everything. So you can't talk down to these kids as if they're idiots, because they know.
But here's the thing you got to understand. We're talking about educated people, uneducated people. The people around DeSantis is educated. These people are well educated, but their thinking is Confederacy.
They know the truth.
Their thinking is Confederacy, people. Diaz, who is the commissioner of education, he is the one employing this thing. He is saying, we are going to, I want you to go back and look at DeSantis. They say they're going to tell the truth. What is the truth? That's my concern. What is the truth? The truth is based on power. That's what I'm saying. If you win power, my truth is anything I want it to be. And that's the thing I'm getting at.
I'm glad you mentioned Diaz, because I did a lot of research on him.
Man,
Manny Diaz Jr.
that's right.
At first thought, I thought he might be the son of Manny Diaz, who was formerly the mayor of Miami.
Yeah,
But as I kept digging, no, he's not.
no.
There's a Manny Diaz II.
Yeah.
That's the son of the former mayor.
Diaz.
Manny Diaz Jr.
That's right.
I couldn't find anything about where his parents are, who they are. I would suspect there's a Manny Diaz Sr., who's the father of Manny Diaz Jr., but I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it. So is he a phony?
I know.
Is this a George Santos type individual? At any rate, that was a whole nother subject matter.
But it does raise a question. It's one thing to have a base of supporters who are grossly undereducated. It's another thing to have people who know exactly what they're doing.
Exactly.
That can be difficult for a lot of citizens to understand. That is sinister,
Yes.
and that is knowingly devising strategies that are frankly using white supremacy. And we must call that out. And one of the things that's so hard for some people to understand about why DeSantis is struggling and what, the base of supporters are for Trump, there's not any white supremacy light. There's not bigotry light. You either are all in or you're not. And what DeSantis and these people are finding out is that these supporters believe their country is being taken from them. And you can't moderate their belief system. And so when DeSantis sits down with people like Christopher Rufo and others to devise these kind of strategies, that's what's so sinister about it, is they know exactly what they're doing.
Right.
Okay, gentlemen, we're at the end and I need to wrap it up at this point. And I'm going to say to our guests, thank you, Mr. Robinson, for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And my co-host, thank you again for another healthy, lively discussion. So I also want to thank our viewers for tuning in to the Ray Tampa podcast on 99.1 FM, The Berg, and I ask that you do so each and every Tuesday evening, 5:30 p.m. So with that being said, sponsorships are welcome. Good evening. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Oh, it's